Well, I can start. That's a question concerning mediumship. And, well, as I understand, in such situations, there are, there are accurate information, and there are also, as you had one example about that, are inaccurate information. So say it's 90% accurate information and 10% inaccurate information. So my question is concerning the 10% inaccurate information. So I have two questions actually. The first is, do you do anything about it? Do you have any explanations why these are, if you have some idea about how this communication is going on and the spirit, how, where does it go wrong, so to say, in the spirit has forgotten or the medium has filtered it or anything like that? Sure. So that's my first question.
Okay. So to summarise the question, basically in experimental tests of mediums, there's never an instance when they are 100% accurate. There are inaccuracies in there as well. And how on earth are we to understand the inaccuracies? I think if a medium were here, they might start to answer by saying that the difficulty for them is that they are interpreting the material that they get to convey to the client, and they're the only one in that threesome that doesn't know anything about the context of that information. So they're not as able to fill in the gaps. And so they would argue that, for example, if they get something symbolic, and very often the information they receive is embodied in some way, so they might have some kind of imagery, or they might hear a word or some half of a sentence, or they may have an embodied feeling, and they have to elaborate on that to interpret it. And in that elaboration, there's lots of scope for errors to creep in, misinterpretation of that core message. So I think that would be part of the answer. I don't think there's been any systematic analysis of errors as such, but there has been a tradition of analysing the transcripts in a way that focuses very much on chopping them into analysable elements and then judging how common each of those elements is. So would it apply to 10% of the general population or to 90%? And then determining whether it was accurate in this case and using this to compute some kind of outcome. And the big issue with that for me is that it loses any sense of the actual human connection between the originator and the end person. So, for example, there may be something that's said that is quite vague and general and could apply to many people. You're taking your partner for granted. I'm really concerned that you're focusing too much on your career and you need to spend more time at home with your partner. Sounds like a platitude, but it may be exactly what you need to hear from your loved one in spirit at that moment in time, and that may be very meaningful to you in a way that gets lost with those forms of analysis. And that might apply to things which are inaccurate too. So very commonly it's claimed that some of the information that we receive that we're unable to place, when we later go home to the family and explore it with them in a little bit more detail, somebody there says, well actually no, that is true. You know, your grandfather did have a dog like that, you just don't remember. So that makes things ambiguous. Now, having said that, even some of the greatest mediums, Mrs. Piper, for example, have many, many trials which are awful, which have no material that's of any evidential value at all. And I have no idea why the quality of that communication should vary so much from occasion to occasion. Yeah, please.
Since these are very condensed meanings that have to be conveyed like poetry, I wonder if there's examples of communication where you have poetry or jokes or things like that, which...
I can't think of any that I could cite line and verse for, but there are lots of examples of family jokes, you know, things that were known, so pet names for children, for example, and things like that. or kind of allusions to an incident from the past without spelling it out, going through the detail. And again, they have that character that I was talking about. That's the way that the deceased person would have talked to this recipient in life, which is, in a way, for me, stronger, evidentially, than if they'd given a detailed, specific description of the event. There's almost that assumption, well, you know what I'm talking about, so I can speak about it in this way.
Well, you have the notion of family resemblance, Wittgenstein, that if it's not boxed in, it comes in the family of meaning.
Indeed, so, I mean, relating to that, I think, without repeating the question, I can instead say, language is purposefully ambiguous and open to interpretation. That's how it functions, because it has to be applied in lots of different contexts. And so we're very used to elaborating on the meaning of core statements. And that does allow for that variation, that radiation out in the way that I think you mean.
Yeah.
I mean, to add to that question on some of this coming out like poetry and being very specific, and has poetry or a joke or something that's got structure been conveyed, it's lesser known, but one of our colleagues of the SPR, Melvin Willen, he's even looked at music being conveyed through the afterlife, sometimes through mediums, and even people reporting it spontaneously, where they may have a claim that they've never played the piano before, and yet when channeling, something very specific is coming through. So that there's those, but to a lesser degree. But that's very specific. It has to follow a set structure to be recognised music, you know, if it's classical music as well. And how does it relate to that deceased individual? Were they a classical pianist, or were they known to play the piano and those particular things? So.
Can I just add before that, because you mentioned classical as well, it reminds me also of classical literature. So one famous incident are the so-called cross correspondences. And they occurred at a time when some of the founders of the SPR had passed away, and all of those people were classically trained. So they could absolutely make references to Homer, for example, fully knowledgeable that the person they're talking to would understand what they meant. They could refer to French text in French. And the cross correspondences in particular seem to be not quite comedy, but they rely on puns. So by referring to one classical text and another, they're pulling out the thread that they have in common and turning it into a pun. So those kind of things, again, speak to personality, maybe.
Okay. This is a bit controversial question. Are there evil spirits?
You write that down.
I'll write that down. Are there evil spirits? In my experience, it depends on who you speak to. So some people talk about different kinds of entities that are more or less refined, and that their experience of them suggests to those people that maybe you can't think in terms of evil spirits, but that some entities are more malevolent than others, cause more damage than others. So some mediums do talk in those terms, but equally I know of other mediums who don't believe in good and evil as such, that they're human constructs. Eileen Garrett has, believe it or not, a new book coming out, a posthumous book that will be published very soon, that talks about her conversations with spirit control who went by the name Lucifer. And in those conversations, there's a great deal of conversation about the reality of biblical accounts of the afterlife and the existence of good and evil. And the entity that identifies as Lucifer is very clear that those are human constructs that don't have that kind of a meaning in whatever space that they occupy.
But I mean, we had this question of good and evil in Oslo as well that came up, and so it brought up ideas of heaven and hell, and it's something that you could also look at philosophically or get a theologian involved in looking at those questions. Even with those telephone call instances, there were some people that said that they had had problems from day-to-day life with debt collectors that were calling them and harassing them to complete their payment. And then they found out that the debt collector had died, so they thought, great, this person's not going to bother me, I don't need to pay off that debt. And then they were receiving phone calls, even from this debt collector after they'd allegedly died. And so there were still negative experiences attached to those ADCs. You could even have haunting type instances that people find quite terrifying. The apparition, charges towards them on this particular corridor. But a lot of that could involve interpretation rather than necessarily an evil behaviour, an evil characteristic of personality type surviving on after death. There were just those rarer instances of the debt collector, for example. People also, depending on their belief systems when alive, then that bleeds into their interpretation of, say, a near-death experience, for example. You can have, most of them are very, very positive, but you have people that report non-existence after death, a complete darkness and void, and so when they come back, they're terrified even more so of death because it's an awareness of non-existence, or of fire and brimstone, some sort of hell depiction, or symbolically churches, people in black hoods, chalices full of blood and trying to get the person to drink it. Very negative, but they're very rare, they're lesser so. So some people might interpret that as evil, some of those experiences or interactions with ADCs, but could be a lot of interpretation, and you could, well, that's a study in itself really, to look at the idea of good and evil in that context, but drawing on philosophy and theology as well. But the vast majority of these experiences, people take them as a good thing, healing quality, and revel in them.
I mean, Harry Price was exasperated by how banal many conversations are with the deceased. And it seems to have a presumption that the transition to the next life initiates a transformation, that suddenly we're all refined and enlightened, and that doesn't seem to be the case. If you're a nitpicky, critical person in this life, you seem to remain that type afterwards. A student of ours, her mother was a medium, and her grandfather regularly came through to complain about the way they were mismanaging their sheep farm. And that's how he was in life, and he continued to be that way after death in the communications. So I don't know what we should expect.
Yeah. May I just give an example? There's an LSD researcher called Stanislav Grof. You may have heard of him? Okay. I was at a seminar with him, and he took a very curious example. He had LSD therapy with a young girl that was, very depressed and so on. And during the LSD session, suddenly her voice changed, and she had like a male hard voice, and a spirit came through and said, "Don't touch her, she is mine." And Groff was kind of nervous. And he said, "Well, the best thing I can do is to try to be calm." And then the spirit said, "I can prove that I am a spirit." And so then the spirit told Groff about a lot of his colleagues at this psychiatric institution, of the separate sins they had done, some criminal things, and all that. So, don't mess with me. I can create a lot of trouble for you. And then afterwards, Groff made some investigations about this. Everything was correct.
That account still doesn't rule out the super psi hypothesis, that this could be an expression of the girl's unconscious, is part of our problem with cases like that. It is reminiscent in some ways of the kind of cases of the possession type that Ian Stevenson has explored in the past. It's very difficult because in the UK there is a movement, the Spirit Release movement, who believe that some mental illness is a reflection of spirit attachments from what might be thought of as troubled spirits. And of course, in other countries, such as Brazil, there are spiritist mental hospitals, psychiatric institutions that use that as a working hypothesis. I was fortunate enough while in Brazil to attend a case review for one of the patients they were looking after, and that case review involved psychiatrists, psychologists and a medium. And the medium was interviewed in order to access the spirit attachment and get their account of why they were there and what they needed in order to move on. There's still not enough in any of those cases for us to differentiate between a psychological construct that has psychological reality and some value in being processed and worked through, and something which has independent agency. And if we're open to the idea that ESP is possible, then the living person's psychic abilities can be employed to reinforce something. That's made me think of something which is really useful, which is in ESP experiments, it's quite common for disbelievers to do significantly worse than chance, which ironically means they're using their ESP in order to demonstrate that ESP doesn't exist. But because they don't understand statistics, they perform much worse than they should do. And so it's very possible for our wider capacities to be employed in service of unconscious desires and motivations as much as for conscious ones.
We could keep going on with the good and evil thing. I was even thinking media depictions as well don't help with people's prior assumptions as to what an anomalous experience may be like. But because we revel in the idea of the unknown, but also creating entertainment out of it. And it's more interesting to have a scary ghost as well than a happy one, even though you've got Casper the Friendly Ghost. But the Woman in Black, for example, and this idea of unfinished business and vengeance upon the living for what you did to me that led to my death. And it's the topic of many a ghost story as well, but it's a far cry from the lived reality of the ADCs. And many kind of haunting type experiences people report as well. It's hard for us to sometimes separate the fiction that we know of from the fact that sometimes we eventually get a chance to experience as well. And that's another route you could go down to look at good and evil. I'll leave that one.
Okay. Eric, hade du något? Yep.
So
Yep.
the questions, it sounds to me is like a description of the split personality. Correct.
Stephen Browdy, one of the books in his series, so Browdy is a very highly regarded philosopher. He's written a series of books, and essentially the focus is on the evidence for mediumship, but there are a number of steps he had to work through. So one of his books is called First Person Plural, I think that's what it's called, isn't it? Which is his book on multiple personality, because there are clear parallels between multiple personality cases and what we see with some mediums in terms of these hived off personalities that present as if they are spirit controls. So I definitely recommend that book.
So I have the basics in normal mainstream science, but also in the interest in this area. How do we get these two experimental worlds together, or these research areas together? How do we get an understanding of sea phenomena within the framework or complementary to the framework of mainstream science?
You're going to go? I can.
Yeah, you go ahead.
So the question was, you have a mainstream science background but an interest in this, as is the case of many people that have got involved in psychical research. How do you get the two to marry up? How do you get them to work together? And there's a nice comment in Rupert Sheldrake's book, The Science Delusion, and he's mentioned it at a talk, saying that it's terrible that we've pushed these words paranormal and supernatural. I didn't ask today, but I did in Oslo, the example of staring detection. So you're in a public setting, and you're eating a sandwich or reading a book and you feel uncomfortable, a bit fidgety, whatever, you're reacting. So you look at your environment and lo and behold, someone's staring in your direction. They could have been staring at the back of your head. Hands up, how many of you can relate to that experience? Today, about 50%, I'd say, have put their hands up. We had about 70 to 80 in Oslo with the audience there. It's very common, and I could talk about other ones. We talked about 50% or more, some surveys up to 70 of the after-death communication. So he said, it's normal, not paranormal, it's natural, not supernatural. Most people can relate to these kinds of experiences. Jessica Utz also said that the remote viewing data, this was her presidential address to the American Statistical Association, she said the data for that is really good when she was working on it. It's comparable to a lot of psychology studies as well, the kinds of outcomes, the data we were getting for this. The problem is, most people, because of media and the way people look at these phenomena, they see it as fantastical, when actually, if you make it mundane, if you look at it with regard to all other kinds of human experiences, it's very common. So the after-death communications, it's a byproduct of the bereavement process, or it's associated with a lot of death experiences. So it's so common, push it through like that. If we make a song and dance about it, if we associate it with the media and fiction, that's when people start to get uncomfortable or see it as taboo. The staring detection, that can be looked at through the lens of evolutionary psychology. Is it a defense mechanism to know when someone is potentially our predator? They're invading our environment. Why are they staring at us? For what reason? Does this help us if an attacker is about to pounce on us when we're walking home that night after we've been sat wherever? And so it's got biological roots as well through that. So you can look at it through these lenses as a potential defense mechanism to know when someone is invading your territory and your space. And this is how Rupert has talked about it through the lens of biology, but clearly it has overlaps to parapsychology. So it's sometimes breaking the experiences down and explaining them in terms of they're very common. In some ways we could see them as mundane, but unfortunately because of the media and also prior beliefs, educational upbringing, our religious upbringings perhaps, what our parents have said, they're seen as amazing things that don't really happen, but they make a good story. But that's not really the case. Of course they make a good story, but they happen more often than you think. So I think it's the attitude and how we approach it. Chris and I were talking today about trying to explain to new colleagues for the first time what we're doing. And so instantly we have to break down some of these prior assumptions and barriers and talk about this research in very normal terms. And I think that really helps. It's helped in networking, it's helped in instantly establishing rapport, especially when we're looking at research grants and things like that. That would be my view on it.
And just to comment, my question is also pointing at the framework of the mainstream science. For example, I think it was Professor John Taylor who tried to frame it within, frame telepathy and metal bending within the framework of radio, different kinds of electromagnetic things. Other researchers tried that as well, and it fails. It doesn't fit into the mainstream framework. So that's how could we, with our very huge knowledge about mainstream science, how can we fit in this as well, without just throwing out the big body of mainstream science? So that's more my question, really. But I agree with what you said.
So for each phenomena, we should try to find in what context it's used and for what purpose. If we take a more general idea, for each, there are a lot of, we have mentioned just a few of them, but there are more phenomena, and if we find the context, why do we use this? For what purpose? Maybe we could find a path.
The point you made about evolution, staring in evolution, is very true.
Yeah.
Richard Broughton made the comment a while ago, and he got it from speaking to an engineer about what he did in parapsychology. And he said, if you want to know how it works, as we do in engineering, first you've got to find out what it's for. What's its purpose? And then that will lead to finding out how it operates.
Okay.
So I could come in here.
Yeah.
Eric, what you really asked, if I interpret it, is that what would get things moving, what would get it to flourish, what would get it to integrate? I think there are two answers. One that you're partly in talking about is relating it to consciousness research, which is in the field, which is really what all these phenomena is about. We've got one thing in common. It's to do with the mind-body relationship, and what the ultimate question, what is consciousness? The other aspect is, if you want research to flourish and to integrate, today it's money that counts. And I was just talking to Ulf Ulme. You may know he's done some, I think, important work in the area of predicting shares and up and down in business. And I encourage, I think that's an area where sadly it has to be so, but it's the area where it will get attention and get financing.
I was going to come back in a couple of ways. So this is a regular criticism / question for parapsychology is, in what ways can we make it more compatible with mainstream science? And I think there are two assumptions in that need to be scrutinised a little bit. So one of those assumptions is that science is in some way monolithic and narrow, so that it's a thing we can document and we can map one against the other. But what do we mean? What do we compare it against? Are we talking about quantum theory? Are we talking about relativity? Are we talking about material science from Newton? So there's those kinds of issues. And then the other assumption is that other sciences that have different levels of explanation are compatible with the kind of science that you have in mind. But if we look at psychotherapy, if we look at economics, if we look at human geography, none of those have a point of contact with the kind of science that you have in mind, electromagnetism and physical theories, material theories, and they get along just fine. Our starting point is that we're trying to account for human experiences. So our level of explanation is not the level of the natural sciences, it's not the level of physics or chemistry, it's at the level of experience. And so our comparators are other sciences that deal with human experience. And at that level, there is some really useful and interesting work. So for example, the way in which people experience psi phenomena does have clear comparisons with other areas of cognitive psychology. The way that information, once it gets into the system, is processed is rather like other sources of information are processed. You know, so there's a top-down processing, there are biases and prejudices, and we see them in both ways. So prior experience determines the nature of the experience you have now. So in those respects, we do see some corollaries. I have to say, as a quick aside, I think evolutionary psychology is very much our poor relation, because it seems very often like a projective test to say that this aspect of human behaviour or cognition or decision making is evolutionarily determined because it wouldn't pass the kind of refutation test of Popper, because there's always a way to salvage an evolutionary explanation, whatever behaviour you see. So I'm not at all impressed with evolutionary psychology as a discipline, and I wouldn't want to emphasise that. You know, we can very blithely say, well, as it serves a human need, people might be able to survive longer. That's not a very useful theory. It doesn't make any distinct, specific predictions that we can test. It's just chatter.
I suppose that's why you could link it more then with biological psychology, or just our own survival instincts, like just to keep living and keep ourselves safe. They put it under that one. Louis Sella was the other one, I think, that looked at evolutionary needs serving and so forth. But yeah, Rupert's a biologist, so he's come from.
I mean, Rex Stanford did some really interesting work, and it's absolutely true. You can say, okay, in a Maslowian way, we can say, well, what are the core needs, human needs, and how can we exploit that in an experimental setting? So, you know, if somebody's really hungry and we'll let them out of the experiment to get lunch more quickly, if they do well at this side task, or we'll keep them here getting hungrier and hungrier for longer, then that creates a pressing, perhaps unconscious need. And Stanford did some really interesting work that gave really interesting data that suggested people unconsciously are able to make the right choices in the experiment that means they get out and can satisfy those needs. So you can find parallels if you want, but they have to be at the right level. And for me, the right level is human experience, it's psychology, it's sociology, it's not physics and chemistry.
Yes, I like your explanation, but I actually would like to add something. It's not only about experience. I could bring in William James, for example, as one of the fathers of American pragmatism. He would say that this is about human practices, and that you have these descriptions of mediumship and also of this apparition that you said they bring who, and healing to the person. I mean, there are action and there are actually differences to those persons. So that is actually what we are researching. Human practices of, for example, and as in this case, bringing hope and healing to the persons. So that it's not experience is one part of it, but it's much more in it, I would say.
I absolutely agree. All of those things are absolutely real psychologically and have real consequences.
Yeah.
None of those things that you mentioned are translatable into physics and chemistry terms.
They're about meaning and human action. And of course, that we can't reduce that to physical science, but of course, I mean, as you say, that is studying every day in the social sciences.
Yeah. So it's a big challenge to physics, in my view, that there's no place in physics for consciousness. There's no expectation that there should be such a thing as a sentient biological being within the physical models that are going to lead to this great unified theory. And that seems such an astonishing omission that they can never have a complete theory of anything if there's no expectation, no sense at all that the universe has consciousness in it. And it seems, as a lot of people have said before me, consciousness is the only thing for which we can have complete confidence. You know, the only thing I'm certain of is consciousness.
Yes.
One more question, then we have to end this evening.
I will just try to defend physics a little bit, because you have Tegmark, who has finally arrived at some idea of consciousness state, and John Wheeler was quite open, and you have Eugene Wigner was famous, and so on. But as we know, it's the framework, and people have different perspectives, and I come from a system science background, but you have to have different people with different perspectives move toward a common goal or something. And that would mean to define the purpose and the goal of this.
Yeah.
And people do have problems, and is there a way to enhance the techniques, the psychologists' actions to enhance these experiences, to make it, you know, something that could evolve and develop into something which would be useful, and then the money would come and the researchers would open their eyes.
In terms of training and becoming more aware and finding the benefits of this that could then lead to more acceptance and more research grants, you've got the sought and the spontaneous experiences. For the spontaneous experiences and just people finding more benefit, after having, say, their first experience, they then turn to anyone of us, for example, SPR involvement, and pointing them towards the literature, reading up on that and realising I'm not alone, other people have experienced it, these are what the other kinds of experiences look like, make them more aware of things that they can potentially look out for. So they get these boosters, these little bits of support every time they have an ADC, because they're saying it's not just a sense of presence. Sometimes it's a responsive light flicker randomly to a question that I ask, or there's these symbolic moments that sometimes I've just got to be wary of, and then relate to them however I may do to the deceased. With the sought ones, you've got, as I mentioned, the Alan Botkin stuff. That's become a therapeutic technique that's widely accepted, EMDR. You can apply it in a number of ways, but in this case, it's create an ADC to help the person have that final resolve and saying goodbye. And that's gone to military personnel and really helped them. And that's very much needed, because for a long time, there's always been a training process to become a soldier. One of their complaints is that there isn't an outro. There isn't a D classifying them, a kind of learning to be a civilian again and breaking down everything you've experienced to go back to civilian life. And sometimes there's a post-traumatic stress disorder element from whatever they've had and not knowing how to cope with that afterwards. So we certainly know from World War I that so many people came away with what they were terming shell shock and being severely traumatised by that. And things like EMDR could have really helped those people, and counselling interventions, which of course have evolved over time since then. But looking at what Alan Botkin's done, or the Psychomantium, they've got instantaneous results, good applications that you can apply to a number of scenarios, and that again can go under the banner of counselling, psychotherapy, which if you put it within that, we have a student who's funded by the British Association for Psychotherapy and Counselling, if I got that the right way around, and counselling and psychotherapy, and that's all on the ADCs as well, because it's looking at the counselling process and how these experiences help. So.
I just came to think about eidetic psychology, where they actually find that once you have this kind of gestalt or something experience, you actually change immunologically and psychologically. And even with near-death experiences, you have a higher IQ, better visual experience, no better hearing, but you have lots of improvements. But this is a sudden change. So it's connected with the perception, which is whole, and the person becomes healed. So, of course, this is technically possible because you have Eugene, what's his name, focusing is another technique. So all these techniques show that you have a sudden shift connected to an experience. And there is also a neurologist who wrote about angelic experiences, that 90% of the researchers at the geographical, for explorers in London, had experiences when they were near death, and suddenly something came out and showed a way out, and this is not something they talk about, but when they have this perception, this wholeness, they change, and they get objective information which is necessary.
Okay, very good final comments.
And of course the US military knows that certain soldiers have these abilities. You can look at the research, they are 100% certain that you can train these soldiers.
Okay, very good. Final questions.
Thomas, den sista.
We are to leave here in 15 minutes.
Okay.
That's that's my reason to.
Maybe we have some questions,
We-
space for questions tomorrow.
We will have tomorrow,
Yeah.
and perhaps some sitting afterwards. Many thanks for
Thank you.
this